The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight.
So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me. I'm Charles Christian. With me is Janie. This is episode 34, the 20th of September edition of the Weird Tales Radio Show podcast, available on iTunes and all the usual podcast platforms, including Spotify. And over now to Janie, who's been looking at some of our seasonal festivals and folklore.
Right, okay. Harvest festivals, which obviously are all going to happen shortly. There's a little note here from September 2000, The Telegraph reported, Harvest Festival is upon us again, a time when churches all over England welcome the fruitfulness of autumn by propping giant marrows against the rails of the altars and singing, "We plough the fields and scatter." But I have to break it to people. The Harvest Festival, as we would know it today, was actually invented by one of our great eccentric clergymen in the 19th century. So this chap, Robert Stephen Hawker, he was 1803 to 1875-ish, he was the vicar of Morwenstow parish in North Cornwall. Mm-hmm. And although it was obviously in the back of nowhere, he was quite well known in his lifetime for his very strange behaviour and colourful clothes, and his somewhat unorthodox religious belief, which is a little strange, but anyway. So his antics abounded, and he was said to rescue sailors from wrecks, fought drunken fishermen, smashed up old pews in his church with an axe, and regularly preached surrounded by 10 cats. So, as I say, he just kind of made it up, really. In about 1843, he announced the idea to his congregation, saying he's had an idea of a harvest Thanksgiving. And apparently it did strike a bit of a chord at the times, because within about a decade, the idea had been taken up by churches all over the country, which is quite extraordinary, given the lack of media that would
no
be
social
around.
media there.
No.
Yes. No Facebook pictures of look at the size of my marrow.
That kind of went viral quite quickly. And anyway, these harvest festivals, they became very widespread and then became quite normal for churches to be decorated with fruit and flowers and vegetables and other produce, and on a Sunday in late September or even early October. Yeah, I mean, the Harvest Festival, as we know it, does have a slightly unofficial feel about it, doesn't it? As if it's more belonging to the people rather than church. And, I mean, it's quite a popular event. I think because you can very much identify with it, especially if you're in the country and in a farming community. But it does seem he wasn't, completely just making it up as he went along, because he was very fond of, this chap, Hawker, was very fond of early church history. And he almost certainly, apparently, got the idea from reading about Lammas, which was probably a festival celebrated of first fruits, just sort of coming available like, August, I suppose. And this was in the early Anglo-Saxon church. And so apparently some people do write of him reviving rather than inventing the harvest Thanksgiving. But he may have well thought of that in this way himself, to be fair. Because Thanksgiving, that's not just a UK idea. We're obviously US Thanksgiving, and also China has massive Chinese Mid-Autumn Festival too.
Oh, right.
So not so strange.
Aha. And have you got any other folky lore for us?
The only other thing I could find anything about was in September was Chalk Back Day. This is a little known annual custom recorded in Diss, Norfolk.
Not far from where we are, yes.
Yeah. But it does have possible connections elsewhere. So the earliest recording of it goes back to about 1851 in Notes and Queries. And they say, it is customary for juvenile populace on the Thursday before the third Friday in September to mark and disfigure each other's dress with white chalk, pleading a prescriptive right to be mischievous on Chalkback Day. Apparently, the later writers confirm it was not simply a short-lived craze, but it did survive till about 1900. Seems to be like connected with the local hiring fair that they used to have on the same day, which might be a bit of a clue to its meaning. There's a bit of an account from Yorkshire that really, I suppose, puts it in context of what it was. So it says, at Bridlington, this is 1890, on the Sunday night preceding the fair, which is held on the Monday before Whitsunday, the boys used to assemble on the church green where the fair was held, each armed with a lump of chalk, and each intent on chalking the backs of as many other boys as possible. Excuse me. This often led to quarrels, as the boys then had on their Sunday clothes. So it's kind of like a nice excuse for a little bit of a punch-up.
I think so.
Which, of course, young men quite like, don't they?
Yes.
There is actually a strange echo of this behaviour in reports of Greenwich Fair in mid-Victorian times, because there was a local craze for running wooden rattlers down people's backs. God, if you did that now, you'd get accused of assault, wouldn't you?
You would indeed.
And then have to have counselling afterwards.
Yes. Everybody would have to have counselling.
Well, I would, to be fair. Well, it must be quite horrible. I mean, this noisy rattling thing and a thump on the back with a piece of wood. Anyway, there's another possible link, and that's Chalk Sunday, usually the first Sunday in Lent. And that was widely held in Ireland in the 19th century, up to about 1930. And in the same sort of way, Irish children chalked people's backs on the day, but there was specifically those targeted were unmarried, which could be a little, gentle joke.
Yes.
I find it unpleasant, actually. Or otherwise, the unmarried status of the victim. So that wasn't very nice, was it? Anyway, yeah, there's other examples from England, but we still can't really work out what its meaning is or its origin. It's just one of those weird things we do.
Yes, I seem to recall that the French used to have a tradition of, on their equivalent of April Fool's Day, and you would sketch with a piece of chalk a fish on the back of people's clothes.
Right.
And I think hiring fairs, one of the things with hiring fairs was that if you were being hired, you would have somebody write on your back, make an offer.
Yeah.
Something of that nature. Anyway, I believe the third Thursday in September, it's Thursday the 20th.
Yes.
Yes, actually coinciding with this show.
Oh. What a coincidence.
I know. Thank you, Janie.
You're welcome. See you soon.
Bye now.
Bye.
And here, as promised, is the second part of our interview with Brendan Keane about the Celtic revivalism and neo-paganism and its Irish setting. What about the... I don't know whether this is something that is Irish or whether it's a later English wishful thinking 19th century whimsy, but all the legends about Tin and Nog and that Ireland was a mystical place that you went when you died, or does that fit in there? Am I muddling my Arthurian legends?
Oh, I think you're exactly onto it. I think the Plato wrote of in the Republic. He wrote of which was the name of the it's a personification of a place that's also like which I think is like very arguably associated with the Western Isles or Ireland. I think there's a lot of imagining about Thule and the Western Islands that becomes Irish, and I think that these Atlantis theories. One of the great proponents of this in the 19th century was a man named Ignatius Donnelly, who was an Irish scholar in America, and he wrote a very famous treatise theory that upended Western thinking on Atlantis, and it was very convincing in his view that Ireland was one of the sources for Atlantis civilization. There's another an English scholar in the 18th century earlier named Vallancey. He was an engineer. He was one of the conquering English engineers in Ireland. He took a great interest in Irish antiquity, and was a great illustrator and drew beautiful pictures of Irish jewelry, such as the crown of the Irish High Kings and all of these great drawings. But he had a very elaborate theory of Ireland's origins in Phoenician culture, which is an old understanding of Western civilization, but also in the Atlantis theory, which I mean, basically, if you were to examine the word Celtic, it's basically the same word as the word occultic. They both mean hidden or secret knowledge. And the word rune in Gothic, in Celtic, means secret. And so the sort of what is the Celts is really, in many ways, it's really a sort of evolving priesthood of occultic or Celtic secret knowledge, which includes a history of farming. It doesn't have to be very strange. It can be very pedestrian. It's like the secret knowledge of how to shepherd animals, but also how to shepherd people, how to create kingship, how to inspire cults and popular movements. It's in many ways it's what all religions do, but it's sort of specific to Western, Northern European consciousness, and it underlays, I think, a lot of our modern priesthoods. It's sort of what's there beneath the things that we do today. I think it's still quite present, and I think that's what people are rediscovering with revivalism.
Yeah, and just going through, there's also a tradition, isn't there, that Ireland is the home of the mythical races that eventually gave birth to the Fae, the fairy, as well as the gods and goddesses. I don't know the correct pronunciation. The Tirna Danan, is it, or?
Yeah, the Tuatha De Danann, which shares a root with the Greek word Danai, which is also connected to the river Danube, and some say that the tribe Dan, but that's more debatable. But this group of people were considered. You can use there's a heuristic theory where, a less sophisticated people encounter a more highly skilled people who have a new metallurgy, and that could be who the Tuatha De Danann are. These would be a people of great technical skill who worshipped a maternal goddess person named Dana or Dane, and then came to Ireland. And in their coming, they became the supremacists of the island, and infused it with its Gaelic culture and abilities with stonemasonry and metallurgy and jewelry making and other technical skills. The game of chess, for example, there's a famous story where the great champion of the Tuatha Dé Danann is named Lu, who we were discussing earlier. And he comes to Tara, the capital of ancient Ireland, and knocks on heaven's door and attempts to join them and must become part of them by demonstrating these skills. And one of the skills he teaches them is the art of fikel, or chess. It becomes the origin of the game chess. They actually have these wonderful fikel chessboards from ancient Ireland, and they're in some cases three-dimensional, and others they're you play them from four ends of the board, and it's a very beautiful game. The Norwegians have a similar game, and in bringing that sophisticated culture, they became thought of as royalty or as gods, and the Tuatha Dé Danann then encountered later conquerors, such as the Christians, and in that encounter, the Tuatha Dé Danann, or the old gods, would become less revered. And in that process, which is a literary process, it's a physical repression process, but it's also an imaginary process. The writers of the civilization that would replace the Tuatha Dé Danann would not want to destroy them. And I think this is one of the beautiful things about Celtic culture, is that instead of destroying the old gods, which you might see with, in Egypt, they knock the noses off them or something like that, with the literati of Celtic culture, they shrunk them. So the great giants of the Tuatha Dé Danann were relegated to what they called the underworld, or the Sidhe, under the Sidhe, and so the gods that were once towering shrunk to the stature of the Diniwa, or the Dinama, or the leprechaun and other fairy folk, and then occupied the physical underworld of Ireland, but also the subconscious of memory, because the folk would still retain fondness for them. And then, of course, this enters into the English literary canon in the form of like the Fairy Queen. Edmund Spenser wrote it in Ireland, and his wife was an Irish woman named O'Boohil, or Elizabeth Boyle. And she would have told him these stories, and he translated them into an English mode, and he turned, as often would happen in that Renaissance English poetry, they take the Celtic names, they might make Anglo-Gaelic translations of them, or they give them Greek names, and so there's this wonderful process where English imagination is infused again with the Celtic memory in the form of, you could call it a subconscious, or the fairy folk.
How does this all fit in with the famine, which I know when we spoke originally you were saying was almost a genocide? Is there a cultural angle to that?
Yeah, the famine was a cataclysm. It's married to Dickensian poverty. So what the English people were suffering at the time was Dickensian poverty, but in Ireland it was Dickensian poverty accentuated to actual food removal. So that it was plotted, it was planned, it was implemented under military occupation. The food was literally removed at gunpoint. Mm-hmm. So the effects of that were to create the Irish diaspora, and in some ways it was it was a great opportunity for Ireland because the Irish that escaped Ireland went to Irish America, Australia, New Zealand, and were able to create a worldwide network, which is arguably more successful than the English network. And so a lot of Irish imagination, translated into like Walt Disney, which you could see as a Celtic revivalism. He was very conscious of that too. He bought a castle in Ireland. He wore a clatter ring. He called his little leprechaun Mickey Mouse. There was a lot of
yeah.
It was all very conscious, yeah, and a lot of English culture that followed was often playing catch up to the efficaciousness of Irish imagination in the post-British world. America, you could see American character was up until the 1970s, maybe. The 1980s was very Irish in its or Celtic, from the Scottish and Irish influences. So yeah, the English, the British state tried to genocide the Irish people, and they did terrible damage to the population. But they escaped, and they brought their culture abroad. It changed. It became Celtic culture has this very high standard of aesthetic accomplishment, but it also has, in the New World, a kitsch. Celtic kitsch is really a phenomenon, and I think it's another part of Celtic revival.
Celtic kitsch being an example. The fact in Chicago, till recently, certainly they used to dye the rivers green on St. Patrick's Day.
Oh yeah, there's that. I'd say Mickey Mouse seems to me the same thing. Oscar Wilde was a great fan of this type of kitsch. He used to wear in some ways he kind of invented it. I mean, he used to wear a green dyed carnation in his lapel. His mother was very similar in this sort of popularization of the type of scholarly work that his father would do. It would often take the form of like children's stories and that type of thing. And it became in American advertising. It became a number of mascots and the holidays, like St. Patrick's Day became a very kitsch phenomenon, but it's all part of a strange escapism but like a literal escape. Like the escape from Ireland created a nostalgia around the world for it. I think it's interesting. I think Ireland became for for a lot of countries around the world, it became a sort of Tir na Nog in reverse. It became a sort of other world in reverse, a place for Celtic imagination to dream about,
I mean, it's noticeable a lot of American presidents like to claim Irish ancestry.
Yeah. Well, so does the Queen of England. She also does that type of thing. She'll say that she's the descendant of our kings, and so much of English monarchical legitimacy is based on the canon of English literature, but which it draws on the Irish mythology of the lost tribes of Israel and that kind of. Like the British monarchy literally claims to be the inheritors of the legacy of Tara more than they would claim to be the inheritors of like Stonehenge or something.
Yeah.
Because it's very strange. Like Ireland is a sort of a dreamland for even leaders. It's a strange phenomenon.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit more? You mentioned him now in passing, but about William Wilde, Oscar's father.
Well, he was a Victoria's occultist. So he was in many ways the D to Elizabeth. He was the magician to the Victorian age, I think.
Yeah.
He was an eye doctor, which is it's the same concept as the occult. He was a surgeon, and he lived in Galway. His house was called Moytura, which is where the great battle between the Tuatha De Danann and the Malaysians took place. And so he overlooked that mythic battlefield. His house is now owned by U2's The Edge, and as I went to the house last year. I hopped over the fence. I was very interested to see it. And he has a high cross, a beautiful high Celtic cross is his grave marker and it is a magnificent view of Loch Corrib, Galway's river. And he's written books on Loch Corrib. He wrote books on the Boyne, the artifacts. He was a great scholar of the mythology. He used to provide medical services to local Galwegians, and of course they would come. They were poor. They might offer him a chicken in trade for his medical advice.
Yeah.
But often they didn't even have that, and he would treat their babies if they just told him a story. And he collected their stories, and he married a woman who took the pen name Speranza, and which means hope, and she became an Irish nationalist, as a lot of the landlords in Ireland became in that period. After the famine, a lot of the landlords' sympathies changed, and they became very Irish in their imagination. And he was one of the great leaders of that. And I think he had a lot to do with helping Victoria romance her Gaelic roots as she came to think of them. William Wilde was just like Oscar is the name of Finn McCool had his son. His name was Oisin, and Oisin's son was named Oscar. And Oscar is the root of the Hollywood statue in Hollywood that the actors get every year. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's the name of the hero who conquers the world. So when Cameron won the Oscar for the Titanic, he called himself the King of the World, and he was consciously invoking the patronym for Oscar. But William Wilde named his son after the same man, after the same hero. But just like Oscar, William became the object of a hate campaign, and the British aristocracy started to turn against Celtic roots as they had in the days of Culloden. A lot of that had to do with the Fenian uprisings after the famine. After the famine, the Fenians came into power, and Parnell became a great force in Westminster. And so a lot of them just started to turn against Celtic revivalism as a threat to British security. And so William became the object of a hate campaign. He was falsely accused of sexual indecency himself, just like his son would be. Mm-hmm. And he was brought through a lengthy trial, actually, and he was bankrupted as a result. His wife was also bankrupted. So he fell into ignominy, and his son would meet the same fate. It's sort of, I think their biographies really point to that aspect of Celtic revivalism, that it was the English could indulge it, they could take an interest in it, but ultimately they found it threatening. It's a strange theory, but pun has a lot to do with, the jail that Oscar Wilde was put into was called Reading Gaol, which sounds to me a lot like a pun on Reading Gale.
Yes.
Yeah, but I don't. Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, that was the thing.
I think that's a bit far-fetched, but going back to your...
It is a bit far-fetched. I've often said that too, not the aplomb I always thought I'd get, but no, I hold... Maybe, I don't know.
But Parnell was also discredited over his private life, and his career ended in ignominy as well.
Well, they used... That was the Catholic... British alliance was really strong, and so the Catholics would make inroads into England by serving them in Ireland. So it was wanted that Parnell fall, and so the Catholic priests made sermons all around the country denouncing Parnell's sexual sins. But it was a Victorianism, really. The Victorians were susceptible to that too. You're always afraid of libel.
And where are we now with Irish Celtic revivalism? What's the current position given the state of the country?
Yeah, it's, there's a great revival of paganism amongst the English. I think what's going on really is that there is a English desire to own it. I think the English, after the 1970s, with the death of the Kennedys, I think there has been a real effort to own Celtic revivalism. So I think, if you look at like Led Zeppelin's work, it sort of takes Celtic imagery, Celtic symbols, like the pipes. He uses the pipes, and he uses the triskel. He uses other, and I think what happens is it's a desire for the English to own the entire revival. And but the presentation isn't as authentic. It's sort of like a red herring in the way it's done. It's not quite right. It's not frowning upon learning the Celtic languages. If you dress up in a white robe and dance on Stonehenge. Stonehenge was actually reconstructed in the 1960s. It didn't look like that. It was consciously created in the 1960s. I think that's a real symbol of what's going on right now. I think if you look into the history of Stonehenge and how it came to be built in the middle of the 20th century, you see that sort of is, I think the British state has a need to own Celtic revivalism. But if you divorce from that and you look at what the Irish and Irish diaspora are doing, much more low key, the Irish language revival is gaining more and more strength. They're opening Irish language medium schools for children all over the island in the north and south, and there's a lot of media that's been created. Like we have a television station now. The last census showed about 1.5 million Irish speakers. Scotland is starting to catch up. They're getting really into it now. They just opened a Scottish medium school. Glasgow is starting to brand itself as a Scottish Gaelic city. So, I think there's authentic revival that would represent, and then there's this sort of I think there's an agenda to a lot of the revival.
Well, I mean, a lot of the English pagan revivalism, Celtic revivalism, does seem to be more of the theme parky, Lord of the Rings type, very, very romantic, but little basis on reality.
Yeah. I take the attitude that culture, especially literary culture, is open for creativity. So I think that the Celtic revival is inherently a creative anthropology. So it's both, the science of philology and study, but it's also living and therefore creative. So when Tolkien reads the philology of England and Ireland, like he visited Ireland, he took a lot of place names and translated them into his own languages. The Hobbit actually invokes the hob, which is a Gaelic word for the fireplace and the home. So I think what Tolkien and that type of English, why I think he's different, and I think because he is searching for the missing Tara of England, because England has a sense of being Anglo-Saxon, Norman, Dutch, Hanoverian, Jewish, and now immigrant. It has a kind of difficulty in finding an authentic English soul. And so what Tolkien was doing, I think, very beautifully and at a high art level. I mean, it was children's literature, but his scholarship was a high anthropology. He was trying to create what he saw every other nation in Europe had done. He saw that the Finnish had done it. He saw the Italians and the French and the Irish had done it. And so he was trying to do it for England. I think he was really successful. I think what he did I wouldn't call it authentic, but I think it was genius. Mm-hmm. And so it achieved something. I think he's achieved something with that.
And what projects are you working on at the moment? Anything related to this?
Yeah, I'm working on a book called the Agam Mago, which basically is a book about the Celtic and Latin origins of Western spirituality. And it's a work of scholarship, but I think of it as a creative anthropological work. So it has a scholarship behind it, but there's a story to it. It's told narratively. So it's called the Agam Mago. It's a pun on the word Agam, which is the runic language of the Celts, and Mago, which is the Latin word for magic. So it's a work that I should be done with it this year. So I'm looking forward to getting that out. I'll let you know when it's done.
Yeah, please do. Many thanks for your time, Brendan. Been a delight talking to you, and good luck with the project.
Thanks very much, Charles. All the best to you. Good luck. Bye now.
You are listening to the Weird Tales Radio Show with Charles Christian on internet radio and podcast.
One story we didn't have time for in one of our more recent episodes was a list of links to near-pagan groups and resources, which is kindly provided by one of our interviewees, Inanna Arthun. So here we go.
The foundational history of the pagan movement in America, which is now out in its third edition, came out in 2006, is Drawing Down the Moon, is the title of the book, Drawing Down the Moon. By Margot Adler. That's Margot with a T on the end.
Yep.
Adler, A-D-L-E-R. She's the granddaughter of the psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And she started out in the 70s with the first edition, then did a second edition in the 80s, which I actually helped contribute to. And then the third edition came out in 2006, and she very sadly passed away a couple of years ago. But that just covers everything. It's a very comprehensive overview of the history of the pagan movement in the United States and a little bit of the British, just in terms of how, because the British really influenced, when it moved across the pond, it really influenced some of the things that started here.
Yeah.
But many of the movements here are quite unique to the United States. Then there is a book called Never Again, The Burning Times, Paganism Revived. by Loretta O'Ryan is the author's name. And that is another history, someone who is very, very, I know her personally, was very, very closely involved with the pagan community in the United States. And then Dr. Helen A. Berger is a scholar who wrote A Community of Witches. And that is a book about contemporary neo-paganism and witchcraft in the United States. And that came out in the 90s. And she interviewed me for that book because I was at Harvard at the time. And she was really interested in my being at Harvard as a pagan. Okay, and then website. There is a website called Patheos, patheos.com, Patheos.
Mm-hmm.
They are general collection of hundreds of blogs on all different spiritual topics. However, they have an entire category devoted to paganism. Right. And that's a wonderful resource for people who just want to explore a lot of different articles and approaches and attitudes and styles. There is also a website called The Wild Hunt, and that is a blog about pagan news and pagan issues. It's a good way to stay in touch with what's going on. Anyway, so yeah, and then paganpride.org. The Pagan Pride Project lists all the pagan pride around the United States gatherings that are happening. And that's another one. If you're interested in finding your local pagan pride or your local events. Also, Witchfox. Witchfox.com. That's witch, VOX.com. If people, especially people who live in an area where it's a little more conservative and maybe they're not quite sure how to find if there's a local store and the local store is being very discreet about how they present themselves, a lot of these places will advertise on Witchfox. So they have listings on Witchfox, and that's a great place to find what might be happening or might be available locally. If you can find a local store that's running classes and things, they will often have a bulletin board and they'll have meetups and they'll have all kinds of ways to meet people. So witchfox.com is another really good resource for people looking for more information or to contact folks in their area.
That's it. We're all out of time. I look forward to joining you again, but until then, may your gods and goddesses protect you from ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties and things that go bump in the night. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon. Which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your fortnightly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic and folklore. Keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com or by email at urbanfantasist@icloud.com and on Twitter at Christian Uncut. Good night. Join us again in 2 weeks' time for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show.